Hello, this is a quick review for students that missed week 2, day 1 of Introduction to Wellbeing. We're going to start with Psalm 139:14. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Just a quick reminder as we start this unit, this course is not intended to be for clinical mental health concerns. This is just to explore common collegiate challenges in college. And so we're offering information about skills and practices which could become habits and which, if habitually engaged in throughout life, could foster well-being. However, we really want to be careful that we're not misapplying or misunderstanding this material. If you or a friend have a concern, mental health concern that is disrupting your life on a regular basis, I would strongly encourage you to look at working with a professional and would not want you to misuse course material, which is really meant to be for like self-engagement and responding to the concerns that are have not reached the point of significant disruption or interruption in your life. So in each unit, we will work from one topic, day 1, day 2. So today we're focusing on increasing our knowledge and self-awareness around common challenges. And then in day 2 of this week, we'll look at supporting our dimension through different habits, and deciding whether or not we want use our agency to enact on those habits. Why are we learning about stress? At this point, you've already listened to a lesson all about stress. Stress can be useful and also can make life challenging. So hopefully in the core lesson, you noticed the nuance here. And that's what we want you to take away. When you experience a stressor in the body, we find it valuable to actually understand what is happening in the body. And so in your SRB, there's a diagram. I'm going to encourage you to pause this video and use that diagram to check your knowledge on the stress response. And if you struggle with that, I would encourage you to go back and watch that core lesson again. Remember the parasympathetic nervous system, that's what slows us down. We're able to rest, digest our food, stay, relax, play. The parasympathetic nervous system, the parachute, slows us down. The amygdala, always looking out to protect us, part of the limbic system that is looking out for potential threats. The hippocampus helps us recall memory, and so helps us confirm, or helps the amygdala confirm whether or not that threat is actually a threat that we should be concerned about. If concern is there, if the amygdala and the hippocampus confirm that there is a threat, they alert the hypothalamus, which is our command central, or at least what we're calling it in this class. And the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system, right? That's the foot on the gas pedal to activate our systems to move into a state of survival where we're fighting or we're fleeing. And then the HPA axis, a secondary response, the hypothalamus activates, which, and the H for the HPA is hypothalamus, which communicates to the pituitary gland, which communicates via hormones to the adrenal gland. And then we have the secretion of cortisol, which gives us energy to keep moving forward. In this day, we also would have talked about a spectrum of stress as a large group discussion, talking about the usefulness of acute stress. That's that quick stress response that is here and then it's gone, and then chronic stress, which is more of a lingering effect. And the chronic stress is where we become concerned. We want you to think about acute stress, right? There's immediate, quick experience that needs, or a stressor that needs a quick response. Maybe it's taking a test or playing in a game. And so we want to recognize that there's a need to mobilize those resources. Chronic stress, that prolonged experience of stress, that's where we can have various health concerns. You learned about those in your core lesson, but we also want to highlight anxiety, depression, memory impairment, impaired concentration, right? That's going to be significant when you're a college student and you need to be able to focus. Not all stress is bad. We talked about the gifts of stress. Stress increases our resilience. It releases oxytocin, mobilizes energy, facilitates memory, right? A small amount of cortisol helps the hippocampus encode memory. Small amounts of stress optimize our cognitive functioning. And you learned about this as you were watching the Dr. McGonigal lecture for this week. Yerkes and Dodson's law, this is about stress and optimal performance, and you have this on page 28 of your SRB, right, where we move from, if we go back to this, we have a low performance to high performance on the left side, low arousal to high arousal when it comes to our stress response on the bottom. When we have a small amount of stress, we notice that we can facilitate the things that we're doing, right? A little bit more stress, and we notice we come to optimal performance. But then over a prolonged period of time, that stressor, we might have to, or we move towards mobilization, or we start to notice our production or our performance is not as strong as it once was. And then we could even move into panic if there is so much stress or for such a period of time. Stress for such a period of time. So stress is useful over here, especially in this optimal performance place on the chart where it's providing us with drive and stamina, focused attention, but then stress can become detrimental. And so what we really want you to think about as college students is how can we become aware of where we're at in terms of the usefulness of the stress we're experiencing, and when can we intervene? And that's what we're going to move to in the second day of class, where we think about, okay, how can we use our self-awareness to intervene in ways that are really useful? And so the cons of too much stress and cortisol, right? The HPA uses all of the glucose. And so we're taking the energy away from the thinking parts of our brain. We'll talk more about the prefrontal cortex later, which diminishes our executive functioning. Memory is suppressed, right? And over time, we can notice the structure of the hippocampus actually shrivels or shrinks, and the amygdala can take over then, right? Which is constantly firing and telling the brain that things are bad and we need to protect ourselves, because the amygdala wants to be a brave and protective warrior. So what we would have done in class is we would have paid attention to, or we would have gone to a whiteboard and really paid attention to what might students notice about themselves and what might they notice about others when we're experiencing optimal performance. So what might that feel like in our body? How might we be showing up to our classes? Whereas too high activation or arousal, too much stress, right? What might we start to notice about ourselves if we are moving from mobilization to degradation, right? Might that look like I'm having trouble concentrating, I'm becoming irritable, I'm noticing myself fidgeting, and then what are some indicators that we could use to know when intervention would be helpful? And those might look very similar to the second column. Christine Carter is a social psychologist, and she wrote that depression and anxiety usually originates with what we call a dysregulated stress response. This means that parts of the brain that signal threats, the limbic system, become hyperactive, making people feel bombarded with worrying thoughts and anxious feelings. Anxiety can balloon in young adults so that they have larger and larger stress responses to smaller and smaller stimuli, right? As we experience our stress response being activated, and when we notice, or our amygdala notice that there are threats all around us, and we have that experience over and over and over, we notice, or the research indicates, that we start to have larger and larger stress responses to smaller and smaller stimuli, right, which can influence our anxiety. And so one of the questions that I would have for you is, what are some of the smaller stimuli that seem to trigger bigger stress responses? And that is brought on by a dysregulated stress response, right? A stress response that is not going back to the parasympathetic nervous system, that's not being able to rest and stay and play, but is always kind of in that state of arousal or activation. So we need to slow down, right? And we need to recognize that we can do something with regard to the activation of our stress response and the production of our cortisol. Which brings us to the mind-body connection. And again, I know I'm going fast here, so you can always go back and look at your notes. But the body can affect the mind, right? We're seeing that. If our physically stress response, our physical stress response is chronically activated, that will certainly influence our mind and our thinking, right? We've already noticed it's going to influence how we pay attention, how we encode memory and make decisions. But also the mind can affect the body. And that's one of the things that we learned in the core lesson, is that we can think our way into activating the physical stress response. Thus, the mind-body connection is something that dramatically affects our well-being. So in this unit, we want you to begin to think systemically, noticing how seemingly disconnected variables influence one another, right? We have the individual stress response at the intrapersonal level. We also recognize that at the interpersonal level, there are stressors between people that can trigger the stress response. And at the systems level, what's happening in our systems and our organizations can influence an individual's stress. So in class, I would have asked you to think of some examples. So if you're at a school that requires you to make a purchase for maybe a concert that you're going to give, and you have to have a particular uniform or outfit, but you don't have the finances, right, to afford that particular uniform, that can create stress at the individual level, right? That's a very simple example of how a system can influence stress at the individual level. And then if I move into a relationship from a place of feeling stressed because I feel like, well, I don't have money for this, or I feel embarrassed that I'm not going to have the same costume or outfit as everyone else, uniform, that might mean that in a relationship, I respond in a way that I wouldn't want to because I'm already coming in with a certain amount of stress. So when we think about God's people bringing renewal, bringing shalom, we might need to consider variables at each level. So we're learning this because knowledge empowers agency. And if we know the difference between a little bit of stress and the amount of stress we might need to perform well, and when we can mitigate stress, when we can minimize the stress, then we can use our agency to influence our intrapersonal well-being. So we would do a diaphragmatic breathing practice if you were in class. I'm not going to for the sake of time. I just have 2 minutes on my timer here. But diaphragmatic breath is incredibly valuable, and you'll learn more about that in the lesson for the next class day. I would ask you to write down one thing you're taking away from today. And then I would remind you of the habit lesson lab experience, where you're going to turn to page 29. You're going to watch a video on expanding your well-being toolbox. You're going to take some notes. You're going to engage in a lab reflection. And you are also going to submit a 2-minute video journal. On the next day of class, this is from a Wednesday class, but it could certainly be a Tuesday, Thursday class. See, you have what you're going to do. You're going to watch this video. You're going to complete the lab. Your lab choices are here. You're going to submit your lab, and then you have your 2-minute video that you're going to submit right down here. And then your next day of class, either Wednesday or Thursday, you're going to complete a unit wrap up. This is not a test. It allows us to see your thinking. We're going to ask you to circle an important topic from this unit. We're going to ask you to tell us something you learned about that concept, why that concept is particularly important for college student well-being. Then we're going to ask you to circle a second concept that is interrelated, another variable that would be influenced by your first variable. And then you're going to talk about the impact of those two variables on well-being. And that is what we have for week 2, day 1. Hope this was helpful. We look forward to seeing you in class later this week.